Welcome to my podcast, The Sexual Shaman, conversations on sexuality and spirituality. I am your host, Kenneth Ray Stubbs. This podcast videocast series is inspired by a book I envisioned, contributed to, edited, and published 30 years ago entitled Women of the Light, The New Sacred Prostitute. This current podcast videocast is a series of conversations with both women and men of the light, all about sexuality and spirituality. We go into the topics of Western Tantra, Western sexology, orgasm, gender, Tibetan Buddhism, contemporary shamanism, and traditional shamanism. Basically, we focus on energy and transformation in all aspects of our lives. Here we openly support all sexual orientations, all genders, all gender identifications, all races, and all ethnicities. The sponsor of this podcast is my energy training, an extensive 20-course program in developing our energetic infrastructure and our shamanic abilities to transform ourselves and others. More information is available at my website, sexualshaman.com. Okay. Welcome to The Sexual Shaman, conversations on sexuality and spirituality. I'm Kenneth Ray Stubbs, and my guest today is KamalaDevi McClure. She likes to be called KD, and so I'll be focusing with those initials. And she is the author and editor of a handful of books, some of which are in process. Being a writer myself, is sort of like their processes may take 10 years. Sometimes you start and you pick it up later on. So they're in process, but she has quite a few books, which you can find on her website, which is KamalaDevi, KamalaDevi.com. Welcome, Kamala. She has been on the cutting edge, on the outer edges of sexuality and its many, many different explorations and expressions, from polyamory to gender questions to sexual orientation, and is one of the established writers in the whole area around sexuality. And we're going to probably be focusing on her book, Sex Shamans, True Stories of Sacred Sexuality and Awakening. Welcome, Katie.
Thank you, Ray. It's such a pleasure to reconnect with you.
Yes, it's been a few years since we have been face-to-face. You are in California. I'm in the Sonoran Desert in Arizona, connecting via the wonders of the internet, because I don't get out and travel much anymore with my particular situation, being quadriplegic. But we have both continued to develop, explore, write, consider a number of questions and thoughts around sexuality and spirituality, Tantra and sexual shaman. What I'd like to do to go in today is the concept of what is sexual shaman. Mm-hmm. That's an important concept because I first started using it around 2002. Just let me give a little bit of that background, then I want to hear how it came up for you. I edited a book which is similar to what you later did with Sex Shamans, True Stories of Sacred Sexuality and Awakening, about individuals who were practitioners who did, in many cases, somatic hands-on facilitation around sexuality and were coming from a spiritual place. Mm-hmm. That book came out in 1994, and it was entitled Women of the Light, The New Sacred Prostitute. I use the word the new sacred prostitute because I I'd ask I chose to focus on women telling their stories. So there are men and women out there in the world to do that. But I thought it was step into this because there's nothing quite like that out there at the time, as I recall. And chose to focus on women. And so these 9 women wrote their own personal stories about how they came to do what they do and what they did. And I asked them, well, what influenced you? Or where did you get your inspiration? Where did you're stepping into an area that is not approved by society, dealing semantically on sexuality. And several of the women said, Nancy Qualls Corbett, book entitled The Sacred Prostitute. Nancy Qualls Corbett, PhD, Jungian psychologist, Jungian psychologist, wrote this book entitled The Sacred Prostitute. And I thought, okay, she was referring mainly to the archetypal historical idea of the sacred prostitute, which was the term in the literature. Mm-hmm. Ever since I was in college and in the 60s, at Indiana University, which had the Kinsey Institute, so it was the topic of sexuality was sort of acknowledged there, at least. That concept of sacred prostitute was the term of choice at the time. And so I used the new sacred prostitute. But then several sex workers said, that can be considered demeaning because you're implying that there's some sex workers that are sacred, therefore some are unsacred or negative or evil. And the concept implies there's something else on the other side of the tracks. And I thought that was a legitimate question to explore. I really did. And I kept exploring it over a couple of years. And I came up one day with, the sexual shaman. This is what Nancy Qualls Corbett was talking about, where the idea of the warrior comes back into the community. He goes into the temple where he's bathed, fed, massaged, talked with, has sexual encounter with the priestess as a way of washing away the horrors of war, which is what we would call the PTSD these days, or something sort of like that. And that sounded great. Oh, wow. So, sexuality being used to accomplish something that'd be very, very meaningful. And therefore I used the concept of sacred prostitute like she had, but I thought, wait, what is another way of saying that? And the term came up was sexual shaman. For someone to accomplish that much in that short amount of time to like I said, wash away the horrors of war, the traumas of war, takes more than just sitting there talking about some intense experiences. It would take something more than that. And I said, that's what a shaman is able to do if he or she's developed it enough. So I came up with the word sexual shaman and presented that at there was a sex workers arts festival here in Tucson, sponsored by some people here in Tucson, and brought together a panel of several people. And we talked about the concept, and that's of the sacred prostitute. And that's where I presented in 2002 the concept of the sexual shaman. I then saw online that it had been used in the past a few times, at least in terms of what Google would bring up the term. Right. Google gives me a lot more answers now. Since in the last 20 years, that term has become much, much more common. But that's when I first used it, and it's been increasing in sense. So that is an introduction to the concept.
Picking up where you left off, I have to say that Women of the Light was one of those massive milestones on my path. So when I first received your book, the year that I read it, I felt like there was an alignment in my own path. Like, wow, somebody's writing about and talking about and explaining what it is that I do. And I hadn't had a formal lineage or teacher who had, said, this is how you do it. It was more like I found myself in the mirror of Women of the Light. Your book was just life-changing for me.
Great.
And, yeah. And at the time, in 2002, which, the year that you came into the frequency of sex shamanism, that's the year that I met my husband, Michael. And he actually was writing a book. He had a half-written manuscript, which he never finished. It's a mess of a manuscript. And he has the .com, sexshaman.com. In 2002, he had that website, and he had this manuscript. And he and I started, in our work, started doing partner Tantra. We were teaching partner yoga and Tantra classes together. And so that was how I got introduced to the term. But it, it's like many things where when there's I see like pioneers who are free, in a certain frequency, yes. We're all sort of tuning into a certain capacity. And I would agree with you, because beyond being a sacred prostitute, as you say, like a sex shaman, in order to heal the war, take the war out of the warrior, we need to time travel and shape shift and go into alternate states. And, I am curious to hear, your essential definition of sex shamanism. But for me, the essence is that we get into these ecstatic states, using the medicine of Eros or Kundalini or life force energy, as opposed to plant medicines or drumming or breath. But we use erotic energy to access, these channels, like go beyond the veils to access the medicine, the divination, the healing that's needed for self and others, to bring that medicine back to the tribe. That's the essential working definition, that I'm working with. I'm curious how you define it in a nutshell too.
It started off with sexual shaman, intuitively. That seems to be conveying what I'm talking about better than the word sacred prostitute. And the alliteration, technically, I would say it's orgasmic shaman, but sexual shaman, the alliteration of it just caught my imagination. What I have come to understand, I don't know if I can simplify this easily without going into a long lecture. Over time, I was fortunate enough to be around some traditional shamans here in the Southwest. There was one in particular, a Hopi shaman who transited this year. I went to see him being quadriplegic. I was in some conditions, and I thought, I'd like to try something different. And someone told me about this Hopi shaman. So I called him up. He didn't have a cell phone. And he said, yeah, come on up. So an 8-hour drive up to Hopi land. And I arrive at his home in Second Mesa, up about 8 hours north of here, on the Hopi reservation, the Hopi land. And before we go into his house, he looks up at the sky. And I thought he was saying some sort of a prayer. Then he comments, that's like what my ancestors saw. No airplanes. 4 days before that, we had 9/11. So all the air traffic was grounded.
Right.
And I was walking into a traditional world in many ways. And I got to know him. And eventually I asked him, would he teach? Teach me what he does. He says, no, he wouldn't teach that. He doesn't do that. Well, the thing is, he was teaching all the time. And because I developed some abilities, which we could call shamanic, to tune into people's energies, to read energetic patterns. I don't mean read people's minds, but read the energetic patterns. I would be around him when he was doing ceremony, when he was doing healings, and I was perceiving what he was doing. Not that I understood it, but my being, the overall higher self, fuller, more expanded self, was perceiving how he was doing what he was doing. Now, he was not doing anything that looked like sexuality to me in terms of sexual activity, but the way he was functioning energetically. And so that, along with being some other traditional shamans and studying shamanism in general, is how I came to the perspective that I want to explain to you. This going to be a little bit of a long explanation, so feel free to ask some questions about this or respond to it. Again, it's based upon some ability to read energetic patterns. I don't see it, I perceive it, and have some ability to interpret into concepts what my being is perceiving vibrationally. Mm-hmm. Also, I feel energy, but it was mainly, perceiving the patterns. And I began to, because I was in the area of human sexuality, teaching sexuality seminar, teaching erotic massage and all around North America and Europe before my neck injury. I was around sexuality a lot, just as you have been. And I had a chance to perceive how people are functioning energetically when they are having sex. One of the things that I began to understand is that when a person goes into orgasm and they're with another person, that energetically something happens that people don't recognize or think of. It doesn't fit in our cultural perspective, but it's not only the oohs and the ahs and the actions and the physiology and the pleasurable sensations. Part of our energetic patterns duplicate, go into simpatico, replicate another person's patterns. You go into the same pattern. So we go into this state of oneness. Right. And that there are 4 energetic structures. In my perspective, there are 20 energetic structures. Chakras are an energetic structure. Kundalini is an energetic structure, but there are other structures as well that what happens in orgasm, automatically those 4 energetic structures just go into the same pattern momentarily. Mm-hmm. Momentarily. And then I'm observing with this particular Hopi shaman that when he was doing his healing, guess what? He was going into the same oneness with those 4 energetic structures, the same, different context, different situation, so that he wasn't having sex or what we think of as orgasm, but he was able to go into this oneness in these 4 different ways. And that is essential. Now, many shamans or lesser developed shamans can do that one way. So a person can just be a shaman and go into this oneness to do what he or she does, but it's only one way. If you can go into it all 4 ways, that I began to realize sexual shaman, high-level shaman, they're the same, but they get into it a different way. Everybody has an orgasm, it's going to happen. To do what a shaman does, you have to become much more highly developed. So that's an essential part. I will say that I do not find almost no contemporary tantric practitioner, no contemporary person doing something you might call sexual shaman or sex shaman is able to do that. Almost none. That doesn't mean they're not doing good things. And my thought is, we could do more. We could do more. And I think many people are in the path to aim in that direction, but it's not there available to us in terms of what's being taught in most Tantra seminars is not that. Or in a limited way. And there's so much more. So that's an essential part.
Yeah. And there's big distinction between sacred sexuality and sexual shamanism, which I think, we can get into. But what I take from what you're sharing around, what I often call there's a merging at points of orgasm. So we have this immense merging. And as shamans, we're multidimensional beings. And by that, it's like not just the physical, we have all these different bodies. And how many, practitioners, or how many people are what are the dimensions that they're on, and they're reading and they're connecting? Like, what are the various planes? And it's not just planes of, levels of awareness, because even oneness consciousness itself, we could say, oh, there's 7 different levels of oneness consciousness, but that's all on the awareness plane, different than what happens physically or with the emotional body, or the subtle body, the etheric body. Like, there's a lot of bodies potentially involved in the energy exchange between us.
We're in agreement there.
I have a fun story just to acknowledge again, Ray. I want to really thank you for, who you've been such a light on my path. And the story is about a particular moment in which, I know we've intersected each other's paths a couple of times from the history of the Dhaka Dakini conference many years ago. But when I was doing my one-woman show, and I reached out to you for some help, because the show itself is about, it was called the Sacred Slut Show, but it was about the ancient sexual, sacred prostitute. And we had a Skype session at the time, in which I presented some piece I was having a hard time with, and you read my energy, and you said, great, because it was a 300-person audience, the theater, and you're like, you're reaching the second row. You're like, I'm sitting in the back of the house and you're not even touching me with your energy. And I was just like, what? You could read this through Skype, and you were really tracking how my energy was moving as I was transmitting. And that was so invaluable for me to resequence, what it means to transmit.
Yes.
As a storyteller, storytelling itself is a shamanic practice, but as a priestie in this practice, it changed my whole performance. So I really do appreciate your keen sense of reading energy.
I wondered what happened, because we didn't have much contact after that. I didn't know if it was very beneficial. I definitely remember that. Great. I'm glad that facilitated expanding that energetic field, so to speak, to a much more inclusive area, therefore more people.
Yeah, and it's a good metaphor, for what we're talking about, because life is a stage. And it's like, in life, who are we reaching? Like, are we performing in a little black box off Broadway? Or is our energy like, really, are we tapped in and turned on and really connecting with everybody we touch?
Yes, we can have the idea of it, but energetically, I think the really powerful actors and actresses are able to somehow emanate in ways that are not seen so obviously, but they impact people. There's an acting skill, but there's also this energetic aspect. And I find that in watching movies, certain artists have that and have much more impact, partly because that they're energetically able to connect deeper and to a wider audience. The ideal is if someone could begin to connect all four of the ways, at least in terms of my definition, that there's a much deeper connection. And while it's not sexual activity, it is the same thing, partly, as what happens in sexual orgasm. So that is part of the concept for me of sexual
Do you have
shaman.
a name for these four ways? Do you have
Well, my particular words would be, which are not or just my words, takes a lot more explanation than what I'm going to say here, but physical body energetic structure, focusing body energetic structure, resonating body energetic structure, and spirit body, light body energetic structure. Or you could simplify it and say physical, mental, emotional, spiritual, energetic structures. That's not it, but that's a simplification. And everyone's developed them, or they wouldn't be alive. It's just a question of how developed are they. And from an energetic point of view, what is important about a sexual shaman or a shaman, highly developed shaman, which most people, most shamanic practitioners, my reading, have not developed very much this way, but that they're able to vibrate, to radiate in a way that facilitates the suppressed energetic functioning of other people's energies. So, like, if you think of this being sort of suppressed, you can't vibrate very much or very fast. And we have emotionality when that comes up. We have discomfort. We feel stuck. From an energetic point of view, a shaman, if he or she's developed a certain way, are able to facilitate that. Simply, it's opening up without going into the who, what, when, where, without the psychological, without the somatic.
Vibrating open.
Yes, exactly. And it's sort of say, all right, here's more juice. Here's how it can change, not conceptually, but vibrationally. And that becomes available for the recipient, the client, to say, oh, I got more tools, I got more knowledge, and I got more energy to open myself up. And that's really important. I want to say it's very, very important, because many practitioners think they're doing it to another person. The problem with that is sometimes you send energy and you deplete your own energy. A lot of healers burn out because they're literally depleting their energy as a way of helping someone else. But it's quite possible to do this without depleting your energy. And that's
the metaphor. I think about resonance on a guitar string, for example. It's like, if I'm vibrating at this frequency, it will, and I'm tuning with a client who can vibrate, it opens them to vibrate perhaps a frequency that was stuck or blocked.
Yes.
And it's not me plucking their string. It's plucking my string in such a way that we're now harmonizing.
Yes. That's very important.
And in addition to what you said, the potential, like the drawback of, oh, I can deplete myself if I'm busy plucking someone else's strings. In addition to that danger, there's also the danger of people being dependent on you. If they can't vibrate themselves, it's like, what's the point? And that's where I think power abuse comes into play, where people they're a lot of times it's like, oh, look at me, I'm such a great shaman, I can do this for you, or I'm healing you in that way, as opposed to really teaching people to fish, and not giving them the feast,
Yeah, and another factor in that is that if the practitioner has the intent of it going this direction, that may not be the best direction for the other person. And sort of like being available to say, here are the tools, here are the energies, here are the knowledge to do it. You choose, your being chooses to do it, whatever's best for you. And I'm just here providing a toolkit. With the energy to run it. And that is very important, because often people say, come from the perspective that you need to be like this, need to be like that. And that runs into the problem of dominating what another person may or may not be the best for them.
Agreed. And this kind of touches in on a really controversial question, and I'd love to hear your hit on it, because a lot of times with shamans, we can access various realms that have various energies and entities, and whether it's the angelic realm or it's the underworld with discarnates. And so one of the controversial questions is like, around when we journey and we use guides and we bring back energies, the fear is always like, aren't you afraid of opening a portal for an entity to come through, or an energy to inhabit you? And I want to name that this same principle of like not reaching into someone else's guitar and messing with their strings is like, hey, if we're vibrating space through space, it fills with essential energy. And that's actually the protection. Like when you're filled with, like call it orgasmic energy or vital energy, life force energy, when you're filled with that, you don't have holes and you're not vulnerable to these other energies coming into you because you're vibrating. And it's very different than I'm going to protect myself. I'm going to put up walls and blocks and wards so that nothing gets in. It's like nothing's going to get in if I'm orgasmically filling the space. There's no space for energies that are lower than, my orgasmic energy.
I would have a similar perspective that lower vibrational, I'll call them beings, can't handle the energy of the higher energetic intensity, and so don't come around. They can't handle it, from my point of view. And so we have a similar perspective there.
Thank you. My cat wants to say hi. So if you hear a little screaming in the background, Kabuki is just trying to make his presence known.
All right. What's up, pussycat? Whoa, whoa, whoa. Cute. Cute. So, any other thoughts, exploring this concept of sexual shaman or sex shaman that you think are important?
I think there may be some distinction, when we named orgasmic energy or orgasmic shamanism versus sex shamanism. I do find the value of the wider perspective because it's not always orgasmic energy. Sometimes it's sexual eros or desire or just sensuality. Like all of that is medicinal or can be medicinal. And orgasm itself, especially when we're doing like manifestation or intention or working in the realm of sex magic, orgasm itself, people can have a lot of attachment towards like, that's the point or that's the medicine. And I want to name that it's a beautiful, it's like a blessing, like when that comes, and it's a grace, it's a co-creation with something, the oneness that's bigger than all of us, but that it's not, like even shamans can get addicted or attached to orgasm. And it's like, that's just a grace that happens when you're on the path and in the eros and in the life force. I think that's important.
So that I use the word orgasm in a very broad sense, sexual orgasm being only one of these four different energetic structures I'm talking about. That's only the physical body energetic structure. And maybe 20, 30 years ago, the idea of male multiple orgasm. How does a male body, that is, have a multiple orgasm? Well, first of all, it's not a sexual orgasm. It is what I would call, using that word, light body energetic structure orgasm, which can happen from breathing. It can happen in a sexual context. It can happen in a non-sexual context. It can happen with genital stimulation. It can happen without genital stimulation. 50 years ago, a friend told me about Saint Teresa de Avila, a 16th century, I think it is, Catholic nun in Spain, since you just came from there. And she would have these ecstatic experiences, like cartwheels across the floor. And why she was not burned at the stake, I don't know, but it was sort of defined. She was able to commune with God, and this is back before I heard anything about Tantra. This is in the early hippie days. And when a person told me that story, I said, "Oh, she's having an orgasm just spontaneously."
Yeah.
Now that I look back and say, "Oh, yes, she probably was having what I would now call a light body orgasm, which is an explosive event and could be ecstatic." There's another type of orgasm or situation that generates energy. And I think maybe it's Neil Armstrong. He was coming back from the moon and he looks out the window of his capsule and sees the planet Earth and has this, I think he called it the samadhi or satori experience. And so he's talking about it on this recording, and I'm tuning into his energies, and I said, "Oh, he just had a resonating body orgasm." Resonating body. That's one of the 4 bodies that can have orgasm. But in terms of, if I use the definition of any event that generates more energy coming in, and the energy doesn't come in from out there, it comes from within. It took me many years to shift from coming from out there to say it is from within us already. We just have to open up to allow it in. And orgasm is a way of doing that.
I love this expanded definition. I know many times when I get, it's like there's an arousal that'll happen and I'll just spontaneously start crying. Like I'm just weeping. I just, and it's okay. This energy is too great for this physical form. It like comes out my eyes. But this expanded like orgasm at different bodies, for me, it's always been, we have the Sushumna, the central channel, and there's ecstatic orgasms at the upper chakras and more erotic orgasms at the lower end, but it's all the same life force, just, almost like a piano, you play, da 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 da, or like it's still. And since you're talking about, St. Teresa's light body orgasms, I want to talk about dark body orgasms because, in your example of Neil Armstrong, we have William Shatner, who just went into space and wrote, he has a ghostwriter or co-author, but he just wrote this book about the immense dark space, nearly like this death, dying shamanic process after his trip to space. He came back and he's seeing the world totally differently. Looking at the extinction of animals on the planet. He's looking at the world totally differently because I believe something got opened in him.
Yes.
With a dark orgasm where, hey, there's energy that's coming through that he wasn't available for him before. And that's part of that, for him, it looked like a dark depression, but it's also an awakening.
Yeah, awakening, yes.
To what
which I would not call dark. We may go, when we open up, we may indeed go into psychological spaces that are not so fantasy. And they look at the reality more as, I can see clearly now that the clouds are gone, but you can perceive more of what is. And if we've been holding back on that and it suddenly comes to consciousness and to our awareness, we might indeed just say, "Oh, I don't know." So I personally would not call it a dark energy, but because in opening up, sometimes, shit's going to hit the fan. You got to deal with it. And that's part of the growing process. That doesn't seem unusual at all. How do you deal with a huge expansion of your energy and your consciousness? the fairy tale that we've been taught in school and religion may be, well, there's something really lacking there, and maybe going in the dark night of the soul as we go into that process.
Yeah, and it's beautiful. He's a very realized, in his dharmic career as a Star Trek actor, but
yeah,
other things. But he's had dark nights of the soul, but just as an archetype of a person who's going, to that pioneering edge, and then looking at what is life about. And, I'm talking about the archetype, meaning that part in all of us that's still up against the mystery of that which we can't ever understand. And that part of us that has to we have to let go of, our minds can't figure it all out. So who are we then? And being in that emptiness, being in that the unknowable.
Yes, that can be very much of a psychological challenge when we've been living in the fantasy of the contemporary culture or non-contemporary culture. Yes, that's a challenge. That is indeed a challenge. And I will say, as we open up, you got to be able to be ready to deal with it, because it can be a breakthrough. It just said, how do you deal with an expanded reality or expanded awareness of potential reality? That's a tough one. I wish it were all bliss. I'm not sure that the bliss and nirvana are on the plate for all of us, but it's in a process of attempting to get there, may be very important, which will have its challenges along the way. Good. Well, we could keep going with this, but I'd like to go into another topic, but something else she's very familiar with, because she has her fingers on the pulse, what's been happening for 30 years or longer, probably, in the contemporary world of what we call Tantra, Western Tantra, Neo-Tantra. And so I'm going to call it Western Tantra just as a term, which is different than Western sexology. Western sexology comes from much from an academic, Masters and Johnson study, Kinsey studies. But then coming into the early 70s, I took my first course called Tantra about 1974, 1975. It was just coming in, and it comes from the East, Eastern cultures, called Tantra. So as it's evolved into the West here, it's come into a different emphasis, perhaps, than in their cultures from which it comes, meaning India and Tibet in particular, or Taoist perspectives from Japan and maybe China. Where are we going in Western Tantra? It's become very popular since the 80s and in the 90s. Very popular. And what would you like to say we are with, first of all, do you have a concept of what Tantra is conceptually, how to conceptualize it? And
yeah, it's a great starting point, because in addition to the distinction you already made between, Western sexology and, Western Tantra, I want to say that it's actually different from sacred sexuality. And a lot of people conflate the two, Tantra and sacred sexuality, but that I think is the even more important distinction, because inherent to Tantra, even Tantra of the West, is this, it's a deeper non-dual practice, which is collapsing polarities. And yes, we're using, the animal body and the God self, like collapsing the polarities of masculine and feminine, perhaps, using the polarity to realize oneness. So I think Tantra as a path towards enlightenment includes sexuality, but it goes way beyond it. Whereas sacred sexuality is a lot of the sexual practices that are bringing healing the split between spirit and sex, and bringing the sacredness back home to its rightful place, which is, in the life force energy. But it's important to make that distinction. And, some people don't. Some people feel like, that it's all just different expressions. But when you're asking me what's my definition, I would say that Tantra is a path towards enlightenment that includes sexuality.
I quit a job so I could spend a month with the Tibetan Lama and retreat for a month. And it was that important. And it was a profound experience. And in the years that I studied with him and meditated with him, I think he talked about sexuality once, in the 3 or 4 years. But he was there. He wasn't even talking about energy, but that's where he was coming from. And this Nyingma tradition, the early Tibetan Buddhists we call Nyingma or Nyingmapa. And so I had the very good fortune of doing meditative practices that focused on the energy. And he taught a breathing exercise, a breathing procedure that I call the ocean breath, where you inhale into the abdomen and comes up to your chest and you release like the ocean wave. Well, I did that and boom, I had an orgasm. Not a sexual orgasm, but a different type of energetic experience that I would call an orgasm. Explosion inside. So, okay, I'm the only one. And then during one of the breaks, another person said that she had had an orgasm during that breathing exercise. I said, but we were in a context where you didn't talk about sexuality. But it was still, you could think of it as Vajrayana or Tantric Buddhism. And that, and so we can approach this that includes sexuality in some ways, but it's not focused only on sexuality. And I usually think of most of Western Tantra is pretty much focused on sexuality. And I really thought we had reached a real low point when I was hearing about some people in Los Angeles. They would have ecstasy parties, drop the MDMA, I think it is, and they would do as a way of having tantric sex. And I thought, if we've got to go to the place where we're putting a chemical into our bodies to do this, but I think that that's a limited view of what we can do with our sexual nature. And I thought, well, and eventually I found personally that if I wanted to study energy from much more of a tantric perspective, I had to go to shamanism. But they didn't call it Tantra, and they didn't call it sexuality. No one ever talked much about that. But it was all there. It was all about the energy. So that's one of my perspectives of what is Tantra is about. Really, it's about the energy, birth, death, life, orgasm, sexuality. So do you have reflections on that in terms of what's happening in the world these days, the Tantra, Western Tantra world or Western?
Yeah, I think we are pointing in the direction of the many streams. There are a lot of branches, a lot of various lineages and practices. And my formal training was actually in South India, and my guru was from Sri Lanka. And when we were studying and going to tantric old temples, and we said we were studying Tantra, the locals would be like, Tantra is witchcraft. Like there was a lot of fear, and there was a lot of like, oh no, that's dangerous. And a local tantrika is someone you pay to help you put a curse on someone you've got a legal battle with. I mean, it's that kind of like, oh, they're doing Tantra, So there's so many different practices and interpretations. And so in the West, there's a lot of confusion, and there's a lot of value to demystifying it, and there's a lot of value to saying, hey, this isn't something we can define. But, different individuals, maybe it's their energy bodies or their the way they are sequenced will open differently with different practices. So I actually celebrate the eclecticness of, hey, study the different practices from the different teachings in the different schools and then see what works for you, as opposed to thinking there's a Tantra guru or teacher out there who knows how to do it, because the real practice is a direct experience. It's
Yes.
something that's vibrating in you now and not something you read in a book.
Yeah. And we're in very good fortune in terms of the technologies where we can travel to be with different teachers, whereas 1,000 years ago, you may only have the fortune to reach one teacher. And this is going into powerful multiple teachers, multiple traditions, multiple perspectives. And it leads us much more to our own integration, because there's so much available to us, which is to our good fortune, I feel. So I'm not.
Also on that note, Ray, because there's such a proliferation or an interpenetration of so many different lineages that we can actually study, as our kind of lay anthropologists that we can be at home with Google, we can actually see what's universal. So there's various wisdom traditions, and we can say, wow, across the globe, from Siberia to, like deep tantric practices in even Latin American cultures, like there are certain like trans lineage teachings.
Mm-hmm.
And there's a lot of truth in that. And then we can also look at, this is really idiosyncratic to that period at that time. Like feudalist Tibet needed this because they were having to hide their teachings from the Chinese. And so there's certain secret sects that have nothing to do with, I'm living in Southern California, modern day, and that's not going to enrich or enhance my life to have these. And some are just pure superstitions that come from ignorance. And so it's really beautiful to be at a point in history where we can look at, what are the universal truths? Because we have access to so many different lineages.
Yeah, that we are indeed very much fortunate, very fortunate to have the possibilities of, maybe this, maybe a little of that, and not just be, well, that's the only way. This is the only way. It's so important. I will say that for me, what I have, where this has led for me was this blend of Western Tantra, Western sexology, and studying with Tibetan Buddhist lamas, and studying with some traditional shamans as well as contemporary shamanism, was eventually got to the place, if I want to integrate this, I have to get beyond the conceptualizations, the compartmentalization. And what I came to was primarily the concept of energy. What Western Tantra did for me was to start to say that sexuality is more than behavior, there's something else going on. And then looking at how people were having these different energetic experiences, ecstatic experiences, mystical experiences, and say, oh, it's all about the concept that the common denominator of all of this has been, if I look at energy. Do you have any thoughts on that? Because I said, let me give you more context. Most people think the focus is on consciousness. I think that focus on consciousness, which is often on symbolisms and beliefs, is a step in the direction, but we eventually have to go beyond those symbols to being in the energy. And that's what happens, I think, that I began to experience, particularly in Western Tantra, was you breathe in unison, you have left eye gazing. That was a step into it as a way of, but you got to go deeper. Do you have thoughts or reflections on any of that?
It's really beautiful, Ray, because I think like it's part of your contribution to the field as an energy master, as like it's almost like the doorway through which you see and bring this, and you've brought so much of those teachings to the awareness of Western and modern Tantra. And I want to say it's unique that you're a leader in that. And I really do acknowledge that. And I think that's beautiful. My personal orientation isn't that, but it is, I've been touched and inspired, by your teachings in that way. I would say my personal doorway, what's most resonant for my entry into Tantra, it looks a little bit more like shadow work. And I say that not like psychological shadow work as much as, for example, breath. Breath is, the in doesn't exist without the out. The out doesn't exist without the in. It's a non-dual practice. The gazing into the eyes. I can't see my own eye. I can never see this eye with this eye. So by gazing into your eyes, Ray, I can see myself. And so when I say Tantra is a path towards enlightenment, I mean, it's an embracing of all of who we are, including that which we don't think we are.
Yes.
Beyond who we think we are, beyond any identity. And so part of the reason Tantra is so controversial is because a lot of spiritual practices have said no to sex and lower energies that distract and distort us. Tantra saying, yes, even that is spiritual.
Yes.
And so it's like, let's say there's no, like a big part of my doorway is like, it's all of it. And anything that we say, this is not Tantra, like that's profane, that's not sacred. It's like, okay, that's my work, is to look at what's in the profane. What am I resisting? What am I rejecting? What am I avoiding? Because that's where my enlightenment lies.
Yeah. When I wrote the introduction to the book, The Essential Tantra, just what came up was to say, in Tantra, everything is sacred, and there are no sacred cows. We don't get attached to, oh, this is sacred and that's not sacred. We do, yes, it's going beyond that. So looking at where I have resistance, judgment is an essential part of the process. I totally agree.
In our part one conversation, where we talked about how sacred prostitute's not sufficient as a as an umbrella for the depths of what sacred shamanism is, because sacred prostitute implies that there's a profane prostitute. It implies that there's, I love that, what's beyond good and bad, wrong and right, sacred and profane. It's like, it's got that beyond notions of God is good.
Yes.
But what comes before and beyond that.
And my experience has been going into the energetic experience of oneness is a way for me to go beyond this duality. For me to connect with another person, I have to let go of what I want them to be, what I think I should be, and just be there and feel the and it can be really, really nice. And so it's a methodology to go beyond the judgmentalness of this is okay, that's not okay. Just be with it. It's an oversimplification, of course.
I love that you brought up the distinction even between me and you, us and them, like what I want of another. Because in some ways, like the deepest Tantra, as much as we love to meditate on mountaintops and realize enlightenment, it's like the deepest Tantra is in relationship. It's like not just your Tantra practice sexual buddy, but like we're in relationship with everything all the time.
Yes.
And so those relationships, like the stuff that comes up in relationship that's our teacher. That's the work we have to do. Yeah.
relationships are a challenge. They are a challenge, and my hat is off to you.
And multiple relationships are exponentially more challenging.
and I'm much more of a monk. I live a monkish lifestyle, anyways, out here in the Sonoran Desert, but so many ways to grow and deepen ourselves. And we've been exploring in our discussion, conversation today, ways of, well, this is sort of how I've gone. This is a concept to explore, to look at. There are no right or wrong answers, and what is of benefit to me, to you at this particular point in time is whatever it is for you. And so our paths are, someone many, many years ago, he was an American who became a Buddhist. This is back in the 60s. He said that the Buddha said there are many ways, different paths to the mountaintop. And so it's really important that each person, I would suggest, look inside and what speaks to you. And in one day you may say, like I participated in 13 Sundance ceremonies. Came out of the 13th and I said, that's it. No more Sundances for me. I've never gone back. Not that it wouldn't be meaningful, but it's sort of like, okay, that feels complete. And so now I move on rather than say, oh, I've got to do this as a tradition. Just simply, it just felt complete for me.
And there's something too, when you're on this tantric path, that it's such a rapid path of transformation. Like those 13 cycles could have been a whole incarnation. And the new you is like, okay, what's the next incarnation of me wanting to explore in this lifetime?
But finding the methodologies, the context, the teachers to do that is going to be unique for each person and a challenge, indeed a challenge. Well, thank you, Kamala. Do you have any, we explored some ideas, pointed in certain directions. Our paths have overlapped, crossed here and there. We have some similarities. We have some differences. And that's so important to acknowledge that there can be other ways than my way. And what is suitable and beneficial for one person, like I said, may not for another. Any words of wisdom you would like to share with us to complete this podcast?
What's coming is since we're pointing in the direction of the inner guru, that it's not, the teachings aren't out there, although we are inspired by those various, encounters. The deepest wisdom is, when you're practicing self-knowledge, self-inquiry, self-love, is to not get seduced into the false self. Like that the practice of knowing who you are and being true to that is knowing who the true self is. Because all of us have wounding and shadow and, false self concepts and coping strategies. And so my blessing and desire for anybody listening is, yes, this is a path that has to be uniquely walked by you. Yeah. And your true north is knowing the true self, and to be really discerning about what is that soul calling, and not seduced into, the personality's temptations.
Great. Yes, we are definitely in agreement with that. It's there's no one way. So, KamalaDevi McClure, thank you very much. She calls herself KD. Her website is KamalaDevi.com, KamalaDevi.com. She has a number of books you can find on Amazon and other places. The one we focused on earlier is Sex Shamans, True Stories of Sacred Sexuality and Awakening. It's a way of learning more about the way different people have stepped into their, at least an attempt to be find their truer self, and embracing sexuality in some way, directly or indirectly, as a way of going that direction, which may not be the way for everybody. And I'm Kenneth Ray Stubbs. This is the Sexual Shaman podcast, conversations on sexuality and spirituality. And the sponsor of the program is my particular training called the Energy Training, which is training that has evolved over a number of years, and it's very much of in-depth training around the concept of energy, which for me transcends all those different traditions, a way of integrating and transcending all those different traditions we've been talking about.
Beautiful. It's been such a pleasure. Thank you.
Thank you, KD, and keep up the good work of helping people to expand at the possibilities of what we can be, especially around sexuality and other aspects of our lives. And I wish you well in the process of writing the next book. Oh gosh, it can be a process. Having come out with a number of books myself, and it's a creative process to see where it all goes. So, folks, thank you for joining in, listening to this podcast, and we'll be back next week with another exploration and conversations on sexuality and spirituality. KD, thank you for joining. And everybody, have a good day, good night, wherever you are on the planet. Bye-bye.